Today we're going to look at one of my favorite works of Soren Kierkegaard, great Christian existentialist, author, philosopher, theologian of the 19th century. The philosophical Fragments, a work that is not as often read or commented upon as, say, Fear and Trembling or The Sickness Unto Death or even Repetition, but is very rich, is very dense, there's a lot going on there, and these themes are very closely connected with other themes that Kierkegaard is concerned with. And I've got some questions up here, but before we get to those, I want to talk about another question that I think probably puts everything that Kierkegaard does into the best perspective. You can say that Kierkegaard's work, in general, in its central motivation, is grappling with the question, does Christianity make a difference? Not just does believing in Christian doctrines lead one to do things differently in one's life, a sort of, pragmatic appeal. Not just in the sense of does one have a different metaphysics, a different ontology, a different ethics thereby, but in a deeper sense. Does it make a difference that Christianity is there and has to be grappled with as something that presents a coherent, not only way of thinking, but a way of life? One yet, however, that doesn't claim to have all the answers. Although some churches may sometimes claim to have all the answers, and actually most of them don't, if you actually read their writings carefully. Christianity by itself is, for Kierkegaard, something less of a system of thought or system of rules and something more like a journey, something that one embarks upon. This doesn't mean that it all becomes very loosey-goosey and make of it what you like, but rather he's focused on the experiential, existential, even affective or passionate elements of it. Now, this book itself is written by, it's a sort of pseudonymous work again, and this book is written from a philosophical perspective, and what he's trying to do in it is grapple with what would Christianity mean. He's sort of approaching it almost from the outside, trying to say, what would the implications be for philosophical thought? Would philosophy be able to assimilate that, assimilate this new experience or being or relationship or even consciousness of what oneself is? So this brings us to these questions. What is the human condition? What is our state? And Kierkegaard very clearly associates that in this work with another question. How do we learn? What are we learning? If you think about it, human life begins at birth, ends, at least in certain respects, at death, and then everything in between is, in some respect, a matter of learning. The infant comes into the world and has to learn a lot of different things. Many people make it all the way to the end without learning some of the things that they would like to have come across, would like to have understood. There are many people who live their entire lives in some sort of dark night, you might say, whether of error, whether of a clash within themselves of their desires, passions. There's all sorts of modes of learning. And before we actually go into talking about those, I want to, you might say, begin at the end. What we're going to cover today here is Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. I would like to start by looking at the very last things that the author says. He's sketching out a project, and both times he's apologizing at the end of the chapter, which I find really interesting. He says, there you have my project. This is chapter 1. But I think I hear someone say, this is the most ridiculous of all projects, or rather, you are of all projectors of hypotheses the most ridiculous. For even when a man propounds something nonsensical, this could be nonsensical, it may still remain true that it's he who has propounded it. But you behave like Lazaro who takes money for exhibiting premises open to everybody's inspection. You are like the man who collected a fee for exhibiting a ram in the afternoon, when in the forenoon it could be seen gratis grazing in the open field. Kierkegaard is admitting here that what he's saying is not something radically new, that he's exploring, that he's restating something that all of us have the opportunity, even without any sort of commitment to Christian faith, by the way. I have to stress this. This is not a committed work. This is not a work of dogmatic theology. This is a work sort of exploring the implications of Christianity from the outside through philosophy, seeing what Christianity would flood into, or would impose upon, or would offer to philosophy. And you can say, well, it's out there. Philosophy's out there. It's all free. Why should we even say, pay for this book? That's what he's admitting to. He's saying, I can't say that what I'm saying is actually radically new. I can't take any real credit for it. I'm just saying it. I'm just bringing it up because it is something worth talking about. And he uses a great example here. He says, everybody knows that gunpowder was invented centuries ago, and it would be ridiculous for me to pretend to be the inventor. But it would be equally ridiculous of me to assume that somebody, would it be equally ridiculous of me to assume that somebody was the inventor? I'm going to assume somebody came up with this. And here he has a really interesting twist. And again, this is one of the things I love about Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard does not try to compel you. Kierkegaard invites you to sort of inhabit a perspective which he sets out for you, and then he says, what do you think about this? Here's what I think about it, but I'm not going to force you. Why don't you tell me what you think, what you say, how it strikes you? And then he lays out various possibilities. It could strike you this way, it could strike you this way. So he says, now I'm going to be so polite as to assume that you are the author of my project. Greater politeness than this you can scarcely ask. Or if you deny this, will you deny that someone is the author? That is to say, some human being? So he says, fine. This is something that anybody could think of, anybody could come across. How about you? How about you, the reader? How about you in your own existential condition? I'm not going to pretend to occupy the same place and perspective that you do. But insofar as there is a human condition, you're just as well suited to talk about it and to think about it as I am. As a matter of fact, why shouldn't you? Maybe you're missing out on something if you don't. At the very end of chapter 2, he says something kind of similar. There he's now sketched out what he called a poem. Really, it's more like a Platonic mythos. Plato, who Kierkegaard has great respect for, will, at certain points in his dialogues, after they've been doing some dialectical argument, some back and forth, some clash of perspectives, some making the case to each other, every once in a while Socrates will tell a story. He'll bring up a legend or a myth. And invariably, Plato is putting his own take on this. And Socrates will say something like, well, I've heard this story. Couldn't it be like this? And then he'll tell the story. Kierkegaard is doing that with Christianity. He's doing that in this chapter, the second chapter, with the figure of Christ as the servant, as the one who comes to redeem, but not by, just imposing power or sucking everybody in, but by suffering, by undergoing, by taking on everything that humanity could throw at him, and by, even actually dying. Now, I wouldn't even say just withstanding all of it, dying, encountering death itself. So he calls this a poem. And he says, this poem of yours is the most wretched piece of plagiarism ever perpetuated, for it's neither more nor less than what every child knows. I suppose I must blush with shame to hear myself called a liar. But why the most wretched? Every poet who steals from some other poet, and insofar we are all equally wretched. Indeed, my own theft is perhaps less harmful, since it's more readily discovered. And he's saying, basically here, I'm not making up a new story. The story's out there. I'm just sort of bringing it up and you know, shedding a little, you know, new light from different angles on it. It would be as if somebody was to tell the story of the encounter of the disciples with a disguised Christ on the way to Emmaus, and put it into, you know, contemporary things, so they're driving a van instead. Is that plagiarism? No, it's not plagiarism, because you're retelling the same story, and you're keeping the same basic traits if it is indeed the same story. And that's what Kierkegaard is doing with this. And again, he's saying, I'm not trying to like derive Christianity out of my own head. I'm not trying to claim that I have any radical new insights about it. All I'm doing is re-exploring it. And all I'm doing is like looking at how philosophy might be connected with it, what its implications would be. So he says, is there then no poet, although there is a poem? Or is this poem perhaps like a proverb, for which no author can be assigned, because it is as if it owed its existence to humanity at large? Maybe I robbed the whole human race. If this is the case, then mankind must be the author. But wouldn't this be a strange conclusion? For if mankind were the author of this poem, this would have to be expressed by considering every individual equally close to the authorship. There is something to be taught. There is progress to be made. So we often think of these stories, we often think of these fundamental narratives that can very easily become just part of our culture and become estranged from religious belief, religious practice, religious communities, as being a kind of common heritage that we all own. But here's something really interesting. Kierkegaard doesn't explore this, but I think that you can see this in discussions of narrative. You really only get out of a story what you're willing to put into it. So if you're willing to study it, if you're willing to explore it, if you're willing to try to not only put yourself into identification with the characters, but think about its implications for you, how it would play out in your relationships, in the world that you inhabit, then you get a lot more out of the story than somebody who's very just passively consuming it. It's only when you might say, take a story apart by its nuts and bolts and then try to put it back together. Sometimes you have things left over if you do that, that you really see what makes it work and what's going on in it. And if the story is not just a story about purely external things, but is actually a story that from the beginning has been about ourselves, who we are. And that's the kind of stories that Plato told, and that's the kind of stories that we see in certain parts, at least, of the scriptures that Kierkegaard is implicitly referring to. So that's a good launching point right there. We're talking about this question, how do we learn? What is education? Kierkegaard only talks about two basic kinds of teaching and teachers in this book. But I really want to contrast this against two other modes of education. And so there is the teacher who is Socrates, and then there will be the teacher who is God. And actually, if you want to be very specific, this is a Christian view. It's an incarnate God. It is a God who takes on humanity, not just a human semblance, but humanity all the way down, all the way to his very nature, places itself into the human condition. And he's going to be exploring what's the difference between these two. Why does he only talk about these two? Well, because he conceives of Socrates as sort of being, but not just being, but also exemplifying as playing out, as showing us in Plato's dialogue. So Plato is involved here as well. The highest potential, the highest activity for human beings acting in a natural way, disconnected from the supernatural or religious. Or you might think of it in a different way, humanity on its own, humanity by itself. Socrates for Kierkegaard represents the pinnacle. This is as good as it gets. A really interesting thing to say, because he's constantly criticizing the people of his own time for assuming that philosophy has made so much progress, or human insight into the human condition, insight into what is education, insight into what is most valuable, has made a lot of progress since the time of Socrates. And Plato as well. Kierkegaard thinks that that's not the case. So Hegel is great. Kierkegaard, likes Hegel in some respects. He actually studied with Schelling, another great German philosopher at the time. But he thinks that the best they could make it to is this level. And all the new shapes of philosophy wind up either replicating this, or they might go on to something else. But let's think about two other ways of considering education, teaching, learning that he doesn't talk about per se, but would be great to contrast with this. And I'm not going to use names here instead. I'm going to talk about functions, the way education works. One way in which we often tend to think about education, and it's a defaced way, it's an incorrect way. It captures something that is important in education, but is not the be-all and end-all, and when it's turned into that, it screws everything up. Education is not merely transferring information. Transferring information is part of it, but simply holding this book in your hand or running your eyes over it or memorizing the lines or even the order of the words is not yet to know Kierkegaard and to understand the thoughts that he had to say. Nor even would be giving a summary of, sort of an abstract of all the different things that are said and all their connections with each other. That can be expressed as information. That can be reduced to information. What's missing there is something that Socrates provided, which is the human aspect. My knowledge is actually my knowledge. And it's not just knowledge of things that I have stuck in my head. It's knowledge of myself in relation to those things. That's a really important thing that often gets left out by educators. Sometimes it gets trivialized too. We feel like, well, if everybody gives their opinion in class, now we're realizing this human aspect. That's not the case. That's not getting to Socrates' level yet. Just merely having an opinion or feelings about things is not yet going beyond a different kind of information. Instead of hard information, it's loosey-goosey feeling information. This is more about some sort of coherence, developing a perspective that can jive in knowledge, in action, in orientation, in relationships. If you look at what Socrates did, he lived a life, and he taught people a different kind of life. He didn't just teach them, here's some knowledge for you, or here's a philosophy or something like that. Neither did Plato, for that matter. He taught a way of living, a way of orienting oneself, a way of choosing. In it, the moral and the intellectual are intimately intertwined. Another way, or another type of way of thinking about learning, teaching, and all of that, that would be the analog over here on this side of transferring information, would be what has been often called in theology a kind of extrinsicism, meaning things are only coming from the outside. You would go beyond the merely human, the natural, what we can access on our own by use of the reason that we've been endowed with, being created as those sorts of beings, rational beings. You can go beyond it in several ways. One is God can actually reveal something, and this is being taken seriously as a philosophical possibility in the philosophical fragments, in part because Christianity makes that claim. Actually, so does Judaism, so does Islam. Every one of the great religious traditions, insofar as it's made an impact on philosophy, one of the ways in which it did make an impact on philosophy was by supplying new ideas, supplying clarification on certain issues, by turning their attention to looking at some questions, some concepts that hadn't really been worked out up until that point. Is it to say that that couldn't have been thought of on this side, on the side of reason? Not necessarily, but it hadn't been. So, for instance, when John says that God is love, that's different than Aristotle saying God is the unmoved mover. That's adding something new. Is it impossible that the pagans couldn't have discovered that sort of thing? It's not impossible. They might have reasoned their way to it. Or God is an economy of persons, a relationship. There we have a distinctively Christian doctrine. Is that impossible on this side? Not necessarily impossible. But it just didn't happen that way. And the great religious traditions say what actually did take place is God revealed something in time. This is going to be a very important thing. In time, to human beings in this way. And here's what God revealed. Now, how does God reveal? That's a key question. Some religious people present it as if God sort of just throws it down on the table and says, here's the truth, shut up, read it, memorize it, start living according to it. That's it. Or, God gave some sort of articulated system of truths and sort of put it in somebody's hands. I guess I imagine that some very, strange Catholics imagine that God did that for Thomas Aquinas. But if you read Thomas Aquinas, there's nothing remotely like that in there. The idea over here would be that God would expose revelation as something like information. Just bits of things that you can throw out there and they apply to us, but they don't really touch our heart. They don't really change us. They add something to our head, but they don't grip us where we are, you might say, in our heart and in our guts and in, our action. And notice, these two ways of looking at education are really analogs of each other, aren't they? They're mistaken ways of understanding things. Over here, again, it's that human, existential aspect. What does God actually mean to me in my life as a human being? That's an important question. I mean, if you're actually going to be a religious believer, Kierkegaard thinks you probably ought to be obsessed with that question. That's part of what it means to be religious, not just to have a whole bunch of things crammed in your head that somebody said God, told to somebody at one time or another, but something that you can actually experience, something that you can have an existential, experiential, relational connection with and live out and sort of explore and build upon and develop an understanding more and more, perhaps not entirely reaching the end point, but more and more comprehensive as you go through, something that you can add to, something that you can revise, something that involves a knowledge not only of what is God, but a knowledge of what am I. And so that's what not Socrates, that's what Kierkegaard thinks is going on with the teacher as he's talking about. So let's see how he gets there. He starts out talking about Socrates and about the problem of knowledge. He actually brings up this famous paradox that comes from the Meno. How can we pursue the knowledge of the thing that we want if we don't know what it actually is? If we know the thing, we don't actually need to go look for more knowledge on it because we already know it. If we don't know it and we want to have knowledge about it, we don't even know what we're looking for. That's a paradox, and Socrates has a way of getting out of it. Like he says, a man knows what he cannot seek, since he knows it, and what he does not know he cannot seek, since he does not even know for what to seek. Socrates thinks the difficulty through in the doctrine of recollection. This is how he gets out of it in the Meno. Knowledge is recollection, which means that the knowledge is in fact available within us. It just has to be brought out. So this is why Socrates is a midwife. He helps others bring to birth the knowledge which they already possess within themselves, but simply have not been able to make accessible. They don't realize that they know this. And this works fairly well for some examples, maybe not so well for other examples, but you get the general idea. If this is the case, then Socrates, as Kierkegaard says, cannot claim to be doing anything for which he should be honored, for which he should be remunerated. Because all he's actually doing is bringing out of the other person what is in that other person. Now, it requires the other person to actually make a commitment. If you're a jerk, Socrates can't do anything with you. If you're egotistical, if you're committed to pursuing other goods than knowledge, or other goods than being a good person, living a moral life, like say reputation or power or money, then Socrates can't do much with you. But if you're willing to put yourself in the dialectic, I almost said in Socrates' hands, but really it's in the dialectic that takes place between him and the other person or the other people, then he can do something for you. What happens then is you have a teacher, and the teacher and the learner are really on the same level. And you can pass things on. The teacher is actually learning from the learner, Kierkegaard says, but the learner eventually can become a teacher in their own time, and it can go on and on and on and on. So if this is the case, like he says, it doesn't really matter historically who teaches you. And time is not an issue in a sense. Time is not an issue in the sense that no single moment really has any significance greater than other moments. And this is something that Kierkegaard is very interested in. He says, for example, with his understanding of what it means to learn the truth, the fact that I've been instructed by Socrates, or by Prodicus, or by a servant girl can concern me only historically, or insofar as I am Plato and sentimental enthusiasm, it may concern me poetically. But it doesn't really matter who teaches me. Nor can it interest me otherwise than historically that Socrates or Prodicus' doctrine was this or that. For the truth on which the truth in which I rest was within me and came to light through myself. The learner has the truth within them. The learner is active in Socratic education. Socrates just helps to guide here and there, to remove a few obstacles, to pose the right questions. Like it says, even in the lower world, Socrates proposed merely to ask questions. Now, Kierkegaard says, if things are to be otherwise, the moment in time must have a decisive significance, so that I will never be able to forget it either in time or eternity. Are there things about our life, are there places where something changes for us, and it had to be that moment? Is that moment precious? From a Socratic perspective, no. This is a really key point. The education could have happened at any time. It just happened to happen at this time, historically, as he says. If I learned about Socrates and the doctrine of recollection when I was 19 years old, it could have been when I was 28, it could have been when I'm 98. It doesn't make any difference. But for a different kind of self-knowledge, a knowledge of the world, a knowledge of what a human being is and how we're related to others, and knowledge about God and our own limitations, it does matter when we learn, and it does matter how we learn it. So he says, let's begin with the Socratic difficulty about seeking the truth, which seems equally impossible whether we have it or don't have it. Socratic thought really abolishes this disjunction because every human being is in possession of the truth. So what does this mean about time? Well, let's do a little bit of erasing here. And this is a timeline from birth on. And I've always had the knowledge within me. That knowledge has been there the whole time. When I finally realized that, now I have the truth being active, and before that I was in error. I just didn't realize that I had the truth within me. I didn't know what the truth was, and I also didn't realize that I had it within me to bring out. Why can we say that? Well, if I actually did know that I had it within me, it's sort of like going to the cupboard, If I say, well, I don't have any graham crackers, so I can't make a crust for a cheesecake. But it turns out that I actually do have graham crackers in the cupboard or pantry or closet or whatever you want to call it. I was just in error. I had it, and as soon as I find out that, oh, you actually do have the graham crackers, I get cracking and I make cheesecake. That's the way Socrates conceives of things. That's the way Socrates has to. So he says, if the teacher serves as an occasion by means of which the learner is reminded, he cannot help the learner to recall that he really knows the truth. For the learner is in a state of error. What the teacher can give him occasion to remember is that he's in error. But in this consciousness, the learner is excluded from the truth even more decisively than before. In this manner, the teacher thrusts the learner away from him precisely by serving as a reminder. Only that the learner, in thus being thrust back on himself, does not discover that he knew the truth already, but discovers his error. The teacher is merely an occasion, whoever he may be, even if he's a god. My own error is something I can discover only by myself, since it is only when I have discovered it that it is discovered. You can actually have people in class and teach them about things which they have a mistaken view on over and over and over again, unless it actually clicks for them and they say, oh God, I've been doing that? Why was I doing that? Now I understand this is a better thing to do. Until you have that moment where it becomes a truth for them, subjectively. It doesn't matter how much objective truth you throw at them. Until something occurs for them existentially, there may be certain kinds of truths that remain inaccessible. So there may be certain experiences that we need to have in order to understand certain kinds of truth given this model. But it's still coming from within ourselves. It's still coming ultimately from ourselves. It's something that we, in a way, have a possession of. We're just not using that possession. Now, he says, if the learner is to acquire the truth, the teacher must bring it to him, and not only so, he must give him the condition necessary for understanding it. And that's part of what education is as well. The condition for understanding the truth is like the capacity to inquire for it. But one who gives the learner not only the truth, but also the condition for understanding it is more than a teacher. Are there things within us? This is where the dramatic shift is taking place. Are there some things within us? Are there some matters about which we can't really have knowledge without somebody else intervening? Or can we just, like, Socrates says, pull it out of ourselves because the truth has been there the whole time? Are there some things where we need somebody else to make a difference? That's where we're going to move to a different paradigm. The learner sometimes has to be transformed, he says. All instruction depends on the presence, in the last analysis, of this condition for understanding it, he says. If this is lacking, no teacher can do anything. For otherwise he would find it necessary not only to transform the learner, but to recreate him before beginning to teach him. But this is something no human being can do. If it is to be done, it must be done by the God himself. Insofar as the learner exists, he is already created, and hence God must have endowed him with the condition for understanding the truth. For otherwise his earlier existence must have been merely brutish, and the teacher who gave him the truth and with it the condition was the original creator of his human nature. What he's saying there is, look, if we didn't already have the condition for understanding the truth, then while we were in error, we were just sort of at an animal level. And we became distinctively human at the point once we actually learned the truth and move on with it. He says, but insofar as the moment is to have decisive significance, and unless we assume this, we remain at the Socratic standpoint. The learner is destitute of this condition, and must therefore have been deprived of it. This deprivation, where could that have come from? How is it that we were in error? Did God do it? Did God set up human beings with the truth inside of them, and then sort of scramble them up and say, all right, now let the games begin? He says, it can't have been that. That would be a contradiction. Nor could it be an accident. This is an interesting argument here. For it would be a contradiction to assume that the lower could overcome the higher. It must be therefore due to who? To himself. The human being is deprived of the truth, in part because of what the human being has done with itself, on its own count. It says, if he could have lost the condition in such a way that the loss was not due to himself, and if he could remain in the state of deprivation without his own responsibility, it would follow his earlier possession of this condition for knowing the truth, was accidental. But this is an essential condition. That can't be the case. Error then, and this is a new way of understanding error, error is not just not having the truth. Error is not only outside of the truth, but polemic in the attitude towards it. Error combats with the truth. Error resists the truth. Error hinders the truth. Error wants to generate error. It's very different than seeing error just as ignorance, as not actually possessing the truth. And that those things that we're talking about here, they reside within the person. When a person is, for example, stubborn, that's very different than being ignorant. It's easier to cure ignorance than it is to cure stubbornness, isn't it? Ignorance, you can inform somebody. That's what Socrates is doing in a roundabout way. Stubbornness, you actually have to work on the moral condition of the person. So he says, the teacher then is God, the God himself, who in acting as an occasion prompts the learner to recall that he's in error. God intervenes in some way or another, maybe not in a completely explicit way, but God helps the person learn about his own condition, that the person is in error, that there's not just a lack of information, but that there's something screwed up within the person that is perpetuating this lack of information, you might say. This state, this being in error by reason of one's own guilt, what shall we call it? And here what we see for the first time is Kierkegaard is exploring certain traditional theological categories, but he's exploring them from a philosophical perspective. Again, you don't need to be committed to Christianity to understand what he's actually saying here, because he's proceeding as a philosopher trying to make sense out of Christian doctrine. So he says, to go back to this state, the being in error by reason of one's own guilt, what shall we call it? Let us call it sin. So what's going on here now? Error is sin. These are perpetuating each other. The teacher then is God, and he gives the learner the requisite condition and the truth. What shall we call such a teacher? How are we going to change things here? Who is actually intervening at this moment and revealing to the person what their condition is? Is he just a teacher? He says, surely we agree that we've already transcended the ordinary functions of a teacher, insofar as the learner is in error, but in consequence of his own act, he might seem to be free. For to be what one is by one's own act is freedom. And yet, to be in error is to be unfree. There's a paradox here. The person is free, right? Because they actually are in error by consequence of their own act. But they're also, in a certain sense, bound and exiled, he said. To be free from the truth is to be exiled from the truth. To be exiled by one's own self is to be bound. Since he's bound by himself, may he not lose his bonds. Well, that's part of the problem there. Here we get into a really interesting issue. If it's just a matter of cultivating something that's within us and sort of stripping away the detritus and the calcs and all the things that have overlain it, Socrates can do that. If it's a matter of doing essentially what in our century we call self-help, Socrates can do that as well. If, on the other hand, the problem goes deeper, and it has to do with a way in which our own nature and our minds and our hearts and our wills have become, in certain respects, misformed, badly ordered, to the extent that they actually affect our knowledge of that condition, our understanding of that condition. So that we remain in this loop where, because I'm screwed up, I do screwed up things, and those screwed up things make me feel worse and actually make me worse, and then I do more screwed up things. When it comes to that order of knowledge, that can become a dynamic. And if that's the dynamic that's taking place, one is unfree. You can't get yourself out of that. You can't just think yourself out of that. When you realize how screwed up you are, this is saying, you can't just say, oh, now I understand. Now I'm going to quit being screwed up. Everything will be hunky-dory from now on. Just, sweetness and light, because now I possess the truth. The truth that you possess at that point is, oh, I'm really screwed up. I've really screwed things up. I don't even know if I can get myself back to where I ought to be. I'm not sure if I can trust anything about myself. What am I going to do? That's an existential moment. So he says, suppose the man or the woman wills their freedom. In that case, by willing to be free, they could by themselves become free. Is this the way it works? No. You have the freedom to screw yourself up by making choices, by buying into all sorts of things. And by the time that you realize that you have that choice, it's usually already been spent on something else. He's got these great examples here in a footnote. He says, let's consider the point. He says, suppose a child had been presented with a little sum of money and could buy with it either a good book, for example, or a toy. So two choices, good book or toy, both at the same price. If he buys the toy, can he then buy the book for the same money? How can he do that? He spent the money, right? So he made a choice. And we do this sort of thing all the time in the choices that we make. Do I pursue this or do I pursue this? Because I can't have them both at the same time. If he buys the toy, can he buy the book for the same money? No, because the money's been spent. Maybe he goes to the bookseller and he says, hey, let's swap. I've got this toy, and the toy is worth X amount, and the book there is worth X amount. Let's just swap. And then the bookseller says, I don't think so. You see, that toy was worth something when you bought it, but now it's not worth anything. I'm not trading a book for that. He says a toy is a peculiar kind of thing. Once it's bought, it loses all value. Then he says, there was a time when man could have bought either freedom or bondage at the same price. This price being the soul's free choice and commitment in the choice. When offer the choice to do the right thing or the wrong thing, that's a free choice, right? Doing the right thing has good consequences, and those good consequences aren't just the external things, it has to do with the nature of the person and their freedom. Doing the wrong thing results in unfreedom. It uses freedom, and then it sort of throws it away, and you can't just get it back. He has another example too. He says, suppose two opposing armies drawn up in the field, a knight arrives whom both the armies invite to fight on their side. He makes his choice, is vanquished, and is taken prisoner. As prisoner, he is brought before the victor, to whom he foolishly presumes to offer his services on the same terms as were extended to him before the battle. And the victor says, you're now my prisoner. There was a time where you could have chosen differently. You could have been on my side, not on that side. But now you're my prisoner. So you don't get to make terms. You don't get to call prices. You don't get to make any sort of swap. I call the deal now. Because you used your freedom before. What that means is that moments in time have decisive significance, Kierkegaard says. So you have here, again, drawing philosophical implications out of a kind of theological understanding of things, something that's coming from Christian theology. Moments in time matter as far as our being in error or being in sin, because we can actually screw things up for ourselves by the way that we use freedom, so that we not only make ourselves unfree, we actually cast ourselves into error. We actually make ourselves less able to understand our own condition, more in a position where we fight against the truth, where we don't want to accept the truth, even when it's being offered to us. So what could fix that? Well, here we come to another moment of significance, he says. The human being can't set the human being free. And so it is in very truth, for he forges the chains of his bondage with the strength of his freedom. Unless his bonds grow strong and all his powers unite to make him the slave of sin, this condition of being in error and wanting, at least with a certain part of yourself, to remain in error, and when the truth is offered, to reject it, to fight against it. So what would we call such a teacher? The one who restores the lost condition, who doesn't just supply information, but it changes the person. What do we call one who restores the lost condition and gives the learner the truth? So let us call him Savior, for he saves the learner from his bondage and from himself. Let us call him Redeemer, for he redeems the learner from the captivity in which he is. And let's call what he does an atonement. It says when the teacher gives the learner the condition for being able to accept the truth and understand the truth, he constitutes himself an atonement, taking away the wrath impending upon that of which the learner has made himself guilty. He takes away the effects of that. Such a teacher the learner will never be able to forget. This is very different than Socrates, isn't it? This kind of teacher, remember with Socrates, it didn't actually have to be Socrates. It could just as well be, Aunt B, sitting on the porch, communicating with you. Or it could be a fortune cookie that, sparks the truth inside of you and gets you thinking. Because the truth is inside of you, right? With this, the truth is actually coming, and the condition for being able to understand and accept the truth is coming through an involvement with the divine. That sort of teacher will not be able to be forgotten. For the moment that one forgets him, he sinks back into himself, falling back into the state of error. So that means that this moment becomes of radical significance. Are you going to fall back in here? That's what we call backsliding, right? Or are you going to keep on moving forward with it? So he says, and now the moment. Such a moment has a peculiar character. It is brief and temporal indeed, like every other moment. It's transient, as all moments are. It's past, like every moment in the next moment. And yet it is decisive, and I love this phrase, and filled with the eternal. Such a moment ought to have a distinctive name. Again, forming a philosophical category from a theological category. Let us call it the fullness of time. Then he starts talking about how this affects the person. And it looks like this is going to be the last thing that we're going to have time to get to in this talk, in this lecture. So when the disciple is in a state of error, he says, but is nonetheless a human being, and now receives the condition and the truth, the condition for accepting the truth, having this removed means not just having ignorance removed, but having what it is within oneself that is resisting the truth removed, and being given the truth at the same time. He does not become a human being for the first time, Kierkegaard says. You've been a human being the entire time, he's claiming, since he was a man already, but he becomes another man, not in the frivolous sense of becoming another individual of the same quality, but in the sense of becoming a man of different quality, or as we may call him, a new creature. So, once again, what's taking place here is a philosopher is trying to understand what it is that Christians keep talking about when they talk about being born again, or being remade, being created and recreated, as St. Anselm has in one of his prayers. Insofar as he was in error, he was constantly in the act of departing from the truth, because error and truth are not simply, I'm going to make a sort of opposed thing here. They're not simply opposites. They're opposed to each other. They're opponents. They're not just opposites, they're opponents. They war against each other, you might say. So long as he was in error, he was constantly in the act of departing from the truth. In consequence of receiving the condition in the moment, the course of his life has been given an opposite direction. So a different orientation of the person takes place at this fundamental, critical moment. The person is reoriented. And maybe not, every single part of them. There's work left for them to do. But something fundamental changes. There's a shift. There's a movement away from what kept them from being able to take on the truth. So what do we call this? Well, there's a word out there for this already. Conversion. Now this is really interesting. How does Kierkegaard understand conversion? Is conversion something where we say to ourselves, oh, now I get it, I'm going to change my mind, and I can do that myself because I had the power all the time, and it's my choice, and so if I convert myself to this thing over here ought to be happy I converted to it. Or if I convert myself to this ought to be happy, because it's my choice, and I get to decide it. That's not how Kierkegaard understands conversion at all. The way he understands conversion is something else comes in and deals with the fact that you're totally screwed up and unable to actually even consider the range of possibilities, and then opens up for you the capacity to actually grasp what the different possibilities are, and then steers you over here and says, look, this is better. Do you want to take it on? Or do you want to go back to this stuff over here? That's fundamentally different. That's a gift. Conversion for Kierkegaard is understood not as the divine, steering you around and like radically changing you and not giving you a choice, but as the choice itself, now that you're able to make it, itself being a gift from the divine, something new. Something else happens here too, and this is really interesting. And this gets to something that Kierkegaard is great at analyzing: moods, feelings, our sentiments, how we affectively understand things and not just cognitively, which is equally philosophical, by the way. Now, if we realize that this is the case, given this whole picture that we've sketched, what sort of mood would a person have when thinking about this process? The fact that up until this time, they've been stuck in error. They have not been able to realize what was going on, even. They've been screwing up. They've been rejecting the truth that's been offered to them over and over again. And it's their own fault for doing so. It says, insofar as the learner was in error by reason of his own guilt, this conversion cannot take place without being taken up in his consciousness, or without his becoming aware that his former state was a consequence of his guilt. With his consciousness, he will then take leave of his former state. This is part of the process of conversion. Once you actually realize the goodness of the good, you turn towards it. But so long as you keep on resisting it because of what you've made yourself into, you will downplay the good. You'll see it as less good than these other things over here. With his consciousness, he will take leave of his former state. But what leave-taking, he says, is without a sense of sadness. Parting is such sweet sorrow, Shakespeare said, right? Anytime you have to leave a portion of yourself behind, you feel bad, you feel sad. Anything that mattered to you that you no longer can do, you can be nostalgic, you can miss it. But the sadness is a different kind in this case, he says. The sadness in this case, however, is on account of it having so long remained in his former state. Once you've had some sort of conversion like that, and maybe it doesn't necessarily have to be a religious conversion like the one that Kierkegaard is talking about. When you have a fundamental reorientation of your person and your desires and your drives and where you're going with your life, you realize your life has been screwed up to this point, screwed up in a way deeper than the screw up that it may still be. And then you can think to yourself, oh man, they've been telling me this stuff for 10 years. I wish I would have done it back then. I'm so stupid. How could I have let so much time go by? How could I have been so blind? How could I have been so deaf? How could I have heard so many times and just rejected it and wrote it off? And that is a feeling of sadness. I think about that myself in my own case. Here's something that's not necessarily tied in with religion. I'm a person who struggled with anger problems most of my life, and I would be very willing to say that most of my life I had a vicious disposition with respect to anger. I wouldn't say I have a virtuous disposition cultivated yet, but I'm at least further on the way towards that. And something changed for me at a decisive moment, at a number of decisive moments, and I was able to see what was going on. I was able to understand the effects of my anger, both on myself and on other people, and why it was a bad thing. When I've been telling myself, this is is a good thing. This is how I ought to act. This is how, I had all sorts of reasons and justifications. And they were not just a matter of not having the right information. It was a matter of my habits. It was a matter of the way in which my will was structured, the directions of my desires. That sort of thing, when that sort of reorientation takes place, and you look back over all these years, and you think to yourself, God, I could have been doing so much better. That makes you sad. That is what Kierkegaard calls repentance. He says, let us call such grief repentance. For what is repentance but a kind of leave-taking? Looking backward indeed, and yet, this is where the hope comes in such a way as precisely to quicken the steps towards that which lies before. So this is actually a good place to stop. This isn't everything that's in that chapter, but those are the key themes. Just to summarize a little bit at the end, what's being contrasted here are two very different kinds of teaching and learning, and they both have to do with the human condition, not just with information. One is the Socratic way, which Kierkegaard considers to be the highest thing that human beings by themselves are capable of. The other involves some sort of intervention of God, a rupture, a moment that attains decisive significance in a person's life, and it involves a different conception of error and truth than the Socratic conception. So, final thought. Kierkegaard has the view that Christianity is not just something that one should accept because it's part of one's social milieu, and then say, well, everybody believes this and that, so I'm going to believe it, and then I'm going to work out the philosophical implications of it. Nor does he actually believe what a lot of people think he does, that you just sort of make a leap into the beyond without ever thinking about anything, without trying to work these things out on your own beforehand, trying to use what we have as human reason, our endowment, to fully understand things before coming to this sort of point. What Kierkegaard is articulating in the philosophical Fragments and in a number of his other works is a very clear conception on his part that Christianity, understood not just as a body of doctrine, but as a way of life, a set of commitments, something that affects one all the way to the core of one's being. Not a superficial kind of thing, but to the core of one's being, not only a matter of one's heart, but also one's intellect. All that said, that Christianity would in certain respects be a more realistic way of understanding something like this. What is the human condition? What am I? It's not just a matter of understanding what is God, or how should I behave towards God, although that's pretty important. It's a matter of understanding, who am I? What kind of thing am I? Am I on the right track? Am I not on the right track? And it's realistic in the sense that it plumbs the very depth of the human being in a way that Socratic philosophy and all the other philosophies after him, according to Kierkegaard, couldn't do. So that's where we'll leave off.